Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jeff Wells. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. I'd like to welcome you to the Brown Bag History Lecture Series, sponsored by the UNK History Department. The series is offered in partnership with the Nebraska State Historical Society. Lectures are held on the second Wednesday of selected months at the Kearney Public Library. These lectures are taped before a live audience. The programs are broadcast on public access channels in Lincoln, Omaha, Bellevue, Hastings, North Platte, Grand Island, Papillion, South Sioux City, and Beatrice, and are posted on the State Historical Society's YouTube page. A schedule for this series, as well as for information about all of the History Department's programs, may be found at www.unk.edu/academics/history. Information about all of the Nebraska State Historical Society's programs and services may be found at www.nebraskahistory.org. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership in the Nebraska State Historical Society include subscriptions to Nebraska History Magazine and the Society's newsletter, use of a microfilm reader and printer at the Society's library archives to make free copies from microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, and discounts at the Society's landmark stores at the History Museum in Lincoln, at the State Capitol, and at Chimney Rock. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the UNK History Department and the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast programs on public access cable across the state and on the Society's YouTube page. The YouTube page is available at www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical. Our speaker today is Dr. John Bauer. Dr. Bauer is a professor of geography at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, where he teaches cartography and regional geography. He holds a bachelor's degree in cartography from Missouri State University and a PhD in geography and a master's degree in geography from the University of Kansas. His research interests include the historical geography of the United States, the geography of the Great Plains, the history of cartography, and the historical geography of automobile touring and transportation. He is an avid collector of automobile touring literature and maps from the early 20th century. In the interest of time, we request that you hold all questions until the end of his presentation, when we will have a question and answer session. Now, will you please join me in welcoming our speaker?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the History Department, too, for inviting me to give this talk, and for the Nebraska State Historical Society for sponsoring it. On June 30th of 2013, the Lincoln Highway Association, along with the rest of America, celebrated the 100th anniversary of the country's first booster highway. Although festivities started nearly a week earlier and continued in cities along the Lincoln Highway route, nowhere were they larger than here in Kearney, Nebraska. On June 21st, twin automobile tours departed San Francisco at the western terminus of the highway and New York City on the eastern terminus, and headed for Kearney. More than 12,000 people crowded downtown Kearney to witness their arrival 9 days later. The Lincoln Highway Association chose Kearney because the city has long been regarded as the highway's approximate midpoint. According to the 1915 Lincoln Highway Guide, Kearney measured 1,752 miles from San Francisco and 1,632 miles from New York City, which placed the midpoint of the highway 60 miles west of town. However, the Centennial Celebration promoters described Kearney's location not with mileages from the official guide, but by referring to 1733, 1,733 miles, a mysterious measurement that places Kearney's exactly halfway across the continent, and which is believed to be fact by many of Kearney's residents. The Centennial brochure explains Why Kearney? Kearney is known for the 1733 ranch, located 1733 miles from Frisco and 1733 miles from Boston, and 50 miles from the 100th meridian. Raised in the 1930s, the 1733 ranch's barn at one time was the world's largest, a block long and 3 stories tall. Indeed, the barn was a commanding presence at the ranch. Built by H.D. Watson and originally named the Watson Ranch, the operation was broken up in 1917, and new owners renamed it the 1733 Ranch because of its presumed location 1,733 miles from either coast adjacent to the Lincoln Highway. A Lincoln Highway directional sign was even erected near the ranch to inform the travelers of the ranch's curious location. For many years, I have been fascinated with this measurement of 1,733 miles. Somehow in my mind, the placement of Kearney exactly equidistant between San Francisco and Boston seems improbable. But is it? Perhaps Kearney really is 1,733 miles from those two cities. After all, distance is measured along a route or path. So by changing the route or path, one could change the distance. We can be 1,733 miles from Omaha if you go through Houston first. Thus, Kearney could arguably be equidistant from thousands of pairs of cities, so long as the person chose the right route or path. But if this is so, what route or path provides the 1733 measurement? And who measured it? And how and when was it measured? Person certainly didn't use GPS to do it. So why does the idea continue to be part of Kearney's identity even now in 2017? When I first considered the question, I found myself staring at a map of the United States. Could the mileage from Kearney to the other two cities have been measured as the crow flies, by great circle distance, which is derived from a straight line on 2 points on the globe? After all, Kearney is near the center of the country. There's no question about that. But when the three cities are located on a blank map, Kearney does not appear to be equidistant between San Francisco and Boston. Measuring from Union Square in San Francisco and from Boston Common in Boston to Central Avenue and Highway 30 in Kearney, the great circle distance between San Francisco and Kearney is 1,263 miles. And between Kearney and Boston, it is 1,486 miles. So clearly, 1733 is not a measurement by great circle distance. It must be associated with something else. What about the Lincoln Highway? I already mentioned that 1733 was used to promote the highway, so perhaps the measurement is an early highway distance. This might be plausible between San Francisco and Kearney. According to the 1915 Highway Guide, Kearney was 1,752 miles from San Francisco via the early road alignment. But by going east, this explanation breaks down because the Lincoln Highway did not go to Boston. It went to New York City. The 1915 guide lists the Kearney to New York distance as 1,632. So 1733 must not have been taken from the Lincoln Highway. At this point, I decided to find out when the 1733 measurement first entered the public's consciousness. How old is this idea? When did it originate? During Kearney's early years, the city was known as Midway City, a nickname which is nearly as old as the city itself. Kearney acquired it because early residents recognized the city's location midway between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean and midway across the state. Midway City was even suggested in 1872 as a possible name for the new town. For this reason, early prominent businesses, such as the Midway Land Company and the Midway Hotel, used the word in their names. I searched for 1733 in two prominent period newspapers, the Kearney Hub and the Omaha Daily Bee. The Kearney Hub archive is available online at the Kearney Public Library website, and the Daily Bee archive is available online at the Library of Congress's website. After eliminating all the references to the date 1733, and a lot of stuff occurred on 1733 date, I found a Daily Bee article from April 22nd of 1889, which mentions Kearney's Midway location and the 1733 measurement. This article tells of a recent trip to Kearney by George Rudio, a traveling soap salesman. During his visit, Mr. Rudio stayed at the Midway Hotel and was puzzled by the fact that the Midway had signs on it 1733 miles to Boston and 1733 miles to San Francisco. It says, Rudio thinks Kearney is a fine place with many improvements, but is down on the bean eater who runs the Midway Hotel there, and says if a traveling man expects a room at the Midway, it is necessary to register from Boston, or he'll get a sky parlor sure thing. George bribes his friends now by promising them a nice box of Kirk's fine toilet soaps, assorted with a string attachment. One thing Rudy can't get over is the fact that the Midway has signs on it. 1733 miles to Boston, 1733 miles to San Francisco. He evidently thinks there is no place like home and should substitute a sign of his own construction, but things have changed during the 2 years that Rudio has been off the road. That's the latter half of the article. In the Kearney Hub, I found an article from August 11th of 1890. At the top of this column is a short poem. They're shown on the left. All hail, thrice welcome, Wolverines. Alas, how brief your stay. Farewell, and now mid other scenes, God speed you on your homeward way. Wolverines? What? Well, the paragraph at the bottom of the column explained, when our Michigan guests alighted from their Pullmans this morning, they were just 1,733 miles east of San Francisco. When they re-embarked at the afternoon, they were exactly 1,733 miles west of Boston. This may be considered a remarkable coincidence, but it isn't. It is simply a distinction of geographical location that no other city in the world enjoys. An article from August 9th, 2 days earlier, tells us who these Michigan guests were. A group of newspaper editors and their companions from the Michigan Press Association visited Kearney on Monday, August 11th, as part of a Western tour. They arrived in the city via the Union Pacific Railroad and stayed just a short time. These two newspaper articles, the one from the Omaha Daily Bee in 1889 and the Kearney Hub one in 1890, were the earliest that I found mentioning 1,733 miles. I believe that together they record the approximate origin of the 1733 measurement. Apparently, someone associated with the Midway Hotel figured out the measurement sometime prior to the spring of 1889. So 1733 has a specific origin and is associated with the railroad. But how did that person know? Presumably at the Midway Hotel, how did they measure that many miles? And again, is the mileage really accurate? To answer those questions, I turned to old railroad timetables. In 1890, railroads were the most advanced form of transportation, and everyone who rode them, including the Michigan Press Association visitors, understood how to read railroad timetables. These large tables showed stops along the way of the route, the scheduled time for these stops, and the mileage between them. Typically, timetables were distributed by railroad companies as small folded pamphlets that could easily fit in your vest pocket. Publishing companies such as Rand McNally, however, gathered timetable information for railroads throughout the country and issued them as big, thick railway traveler's guides. On Google Books, I found a Rand McNally Railroad Guide from 1886, and I studied its timetables, looking for a connection to the measurement. And this is what I found. According to the Railroad Guide timetables, a traveler departing Kearney for San Francisco in the late 1880s would first ride the Union Pacific Railroad to Ogden, Utah, a distance of 838 miles. Then they would continue to San Francisco on the Central Pacific Railroad, a distance of 895 miles. 838 plus 895 equals, you guessed it, 1,733. So amazingly, the 1733 measurement from Kearney to San Francisco is real. The mileage between Kearney and San Francisco, though, was easy to determine from the railway guides because the Union Pacific and Central Pacific systems formed the obvious short route between the two cities. That's between Kearney and San Francisco. To the east, however, I found it more difficult because there were many more railroads. After much trial and error, this is what I found. Heading east, a traveler departed Kearney for Boston would first ride the Union Pacific to Omaha, a distance of 196 miles. At Omaha, they would transfer to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, which would take them to Chicago. That is 502 miles from the two red circles there. At Chicago, the Michigan Central Railroad would carry the passenger through southern Michigan and southern Ontario to Buffalo, New York, a distance of 536 miles. The New York Central and Hudson Railroad would connect Buffalo with Albany, New York, a distance of 298 miles. The final leg would be from Albany to Boston, 201 miles, on the Boston and Albany Railroad. The sum of those distances equals 1733. I was amazed. I didn't expect it to see that. I thought it was made up. So a claimed distance or measurement that today seems mysterious and far-fetched was at one point actually true, if one traveled circa 1886 railroads. I summarized the route distance on this slide. Make special note of the total time. It took 150 hours, over 6.5 days, to cross the United States in 1886. Today, this seems painfully slow. It would be an average of 23 miles an hour. But compared to the alternatives of the period, it was a dream come true to people. Notice the price, too. The timetables show ticket fare, and I totaled up all the ticket fare, and it was about $200. I looked up this morning at an inflation calculator. That's equivalent to approximately $5,000 today. So to make that journey, one would have had to spend lots of money. In August 11th of 1890, the Hub wrote that the 1733 measurement may be considered a remarkable coincidence, but it isn't. It is simply a distinction of geographical location that no other city in the world enjoys. Although I disagree and contend that the measurement was a remarkable coincidence and is now irrelevant, back in the booming booster environment of 1880s Nebraska, though, the curiosity was seen as perfect propaganda. Kearney was in the midst of its greatest period of growth, and civic pride was high. Business and city leaders understood the advantages that came with their location at the junction of two major railroads. Shortly after its discovery, they were using 1733 for self-promotion. Not only did the Midway Hotel place signs in its windows that promoted the measurement, it used it prominently in the company's literature and identity. An 1889 copy of the hotel's envelope and letterhead shows an engraving of the hotel with the words 1733 miles from Boston, 1733 miles from San Francisco, written below on ribbons there within the red boxes. The Kearney Hub also did its part to propel the promotional bandwagon. On October 4th of 1890, the words Boston, 1733 miles, Kearney, Frisco, 1733 miles, appeared in a box at the top of one of those serial fiction stories that were popular in 19th century newspapers. Kearney and the 1733 idea had nothing to do with the story. The box was simply placed there to fill column space and advertise the geographical distinction. A few days later, on October 10th, the Hub ran another article containing the 1733 promotion. This time, the paper described a new logo design that had been purchased by the Midway Land Company. At the top of the ornamental letters is the name of the company, the article says. Below the words Kearney, Nebraska, are two railroad trains facing each other. Under one, San Francisco, 1733 miles, and under the other, Boston, 1733 miles. Between the two, a small hub represents Kearney's position. It is easy to see why, in 1889 and 1890, businesses were eager to incorporate the measurement in their materials. After all, it served to prove what people had long suspected about the Midway city's location. As Nebraska entered the automobile age and the early 20th century, the 1733 measurement became associated with the Lincoln Highway. City and business leaders understood that city's location along the nation's first transcontinental highway brought advantages similar to those of the railroads of 40 years earlier. Thus, the curious geographical distinction of Kearney's location was simply transferred from one transportation era to another without ever questioning whether or not the 1733 measurement referred to the Lincoln Highway. A second look at the 1733 ranch's directional sign illustrates this. The ranch was renamed 1733 Ranch in 1917, so the photograph was taken sometime after that date. Notice that San Francisco and Boston are both indicated, as are the two Lincoln Highway blazes, clearly giving the impression that motorists would reach either city after 1,733 miles of travel. A 1919 road map and tourist brochure of central Nebraska illustrates this further and shows how early automobile tourism promoters co-opted the geographical distinction for their own use. At the top of the map's front cover are the words Frisco, 1733, Boston. Here the name Kearney is omitted, in a sense making the measurement representative of central Nebraska in general. Inside, however, is a very telling explanation. It reads, Kearney's acquired its nom de plume as Midway City by virtue of its geographical location as related to the Lincoln Highway. The city is 1,733 miles from Boston and an equal distance from San Francisco along the route of the National Road. To tourists from coast to coast, Kearney is consequently known as the Midway City or City Beautiful, having been referred to it in the above manner on scores of occasions by writers of national fame. Here the brochure writer wrongly attributes the 1733 measurement and the nickname Midway City to the Lincoln Highway. This misappropriation of the 1733 measurement even extended to air travel. On the screen is the front of an airmail envelope sent from Kearney on June 27, 1930. The red stamp commemorates the dedication of the Kearney Municipal Airport on that date. Notice that Kearney's location is shown as 1,733 miles equidistant from Boston and San Francisco. By this time, the 1733 measurement had become such a powerful promotional tool and such an accepted part of Kearney's identity that Nebraskans never questioned whether or not it was actually true. The geographical distinction remained part of Kearney's identity even as the transportation technology that connected the city to distant places evolved. The 1733 measurement continues to live on in the 21st century. It remains a strong part of Kearney's identity, and many residents regard the measurement as fact, even though they are unsure about its origins. I learned about it on only my second visit to Kearney. Shortly after accepting a faculty position at UNK in 2006, my wife and I returned to Kearney to look for housing. On our visit, we stayed with a friend who lives in the 1733 estates. Part of the old 1733 ranch was eventually developed into a large lot subdivision and named the 1733 Estates. Our friend told us about the history and significance of 1733, and much of it I now know is based on misconceptions. The numbers 1733 are so well known among Kearney residents that a local shoe store occasionally runs a 17.33% off sale. If a customer did not know the significance of 1733, he or she would consider 17.33% discount as kind of odd. But I regard it as a clever, lighthearted acknowledgement of local history. Very clever. Among Kearney's boosters and promoters, however, the 1733 geographical distinction is quite serious business and remains alive and true as ever, even if it continues to perpetuate misconceptions. I will use two recent examples to conclude my talk here. In 2013, to commemorate the centennial of the Lincoln Highway, the Kearney Hub published an entertaining and attractive photograph book about the Lincoln Highway landscapes. The book traces the highway county by county across the state. In the introduction to the Buffalo County section, the author writes, quote, "One of the best known attractions from Kearney's past, the 1733 Ranch, was so named because Kearney is 1733 miles from both the east and west ends of the Lincoln Highway. Although it is correct to tie the ranch's name to the measurement, as I have shown, the measurement had nothing to do with the highway." A similar example comes from the Kearney, Nebraska Community Profile data sheet that is produced and distributed by the Buffalo County Economic Development Office. The sheet's written description of the city begins there at the top of the box. Kearney, the county seat of Buffalo County, is located near the banks of the Platte River and its southernmost point as it dips in a great arc across Nebraska. Located squarely at the nation's midpoint, 1733 miles from Boston and 1733 miles from San Francisco along Highway 30 and Interstate 80, Kearney is a crossroads for commerce and culture. The data sheet even contains a location chart near the bottom of the slide showing Kearney's distances from Boston, San Francisco, Omaha, Chicago, New York, Denver, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. The distances to Boston and San Francisco are indicated as 1,733 miles. The distances to the other 6 cities are close to the distances returned by the Google Maps website. Apparently, the Economic Development Office did not need to consult the Google Maps website for its measurements because it already knew what they were. That concludes.
My parents went to dances at the 1733 barn. And how long did that go on? What was the story with that? It burned down. Did my parents have anything to do with it?
I don't know specific things about the history of the barn. I know it burned down in the 1930s, I believe, was the, because I've heard similar stories too of parents of that generation that danced there. But it's a shame that it's gone because it was clearly so large that it would today be quite a tourist attraction. It would be quite a stop along the old part of the Lincoln Highway.
I was born here in 1949, and I remember people calling it the 1733 ballroom. Did that ever come up in your...
In my research?
Yeah.
No, it didn't, because I really wasn't looking for information that recent.
And I was wondering if there was another structure there that was different.
That was not the barn.
Ah, okay, that was a different thing. The other thing I wanted to ask you was that I've also heard the story that at one time Kearney made a bid for or was under consideration for being the capital of the United States. And I just
I have read
was
that
true.
too, and it's kind of comical that such a bid would even be made. You know, that's kind of absurd when you think about it.
Well, we've always had a pretty active Chamber of Commerce here. So.
Yes, and the Chamber of Commerce does good too, but getting the federal government to move the nation's capital in the late 1800s would have been impossible. But it does, though. It illustrates, though, the booster mentality of the young city, and that booster mentality was present in all young cities too. Every young city across the plains thought that they were going to be the next Denver, that they were going to be the next Kansas City, that the railroad was going to propel them to significance and to greatness. So it doesn't surprise me that they did make a bid such as that.
The other thing the final thing I just wanted to, it came to mind as you were talking here, was I wonder if the Kearney hub, the hub of the wheel, had something to do with the 1733.
Well, I do notice that in one of these, I don't have a photograph of it, but in that written description of the letterhead, it said a hub in the middle. And I don't know if the Hub newspaper was who had chosen that. The promotion, I call it the promotion bandwagon. The promotion bandwagon, there was a lot of different actors involved in there, so I could easily see how the newspaper and the land company could have made decisions like that together or contributed to it.
Thanks very much. It was an interesting talk.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that railroad route to the east. Was that a popular connection that you came up with, or were there so many alternatives that was the only one that went to 1733?
That
did
was the
people
only
take
one that I
route?
could find that totaled up to 1733.
And do you think it was widely used, or?
Yes, I do think it was widely used. That consists of some of the oldest railroads in the East and some of the most important of the railroads that connected the Midwest to the East Coast. So, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy was a very early railroad throughout Illinois, and connections from Chicago west. So that would have been a popular choice. A lot of what else you see on there are branch railroads that are part of the system, and those branch railroads would have been used by a long distance traveler. And the same thing here for the Michigan Central too. The Michigan Central forms the shortest distance, the straightest distance between Chicago and upper New York. And if you look through here, it's the same thing. We have more of the straightest distance. So I did look at other railroads and other railroad timetables and try to put them together. But this is the only one that came up with 1733. And it didn't surprise me much when I saw it happen, because it is the shortest distance by looking at the map, that it's the most direct distance. I don't know if a traveler who would have made the journey from Boston all the way to Chicago and beyond would have booked all of the tickets together, or if they were all booked separately. I don't know enough about railroad transportation in 1800s. I could see how it would take quite a travel agent to connect them all together. And another thing too about the time here, that 150 hours assumes that you do not wait in the station for any time. That is the total travel time from one end of the country to the other. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Hello. I noticed when you were talking about the Lincoln Highway going east, that it stopped in New York and the numbers didn't add up, or Washington or something, and it didn't go to Boston. But what's the distance between that point and Boston? And if that was figured in on the equation, would it make it closer? Because it looked to me that it was...
So here we're looking at the Lincoln Highway, and I
Yeah.
said the Lincoln Highway went to New York.
Yeah.
And what was the measurement from Kearney to Boston?
No, what's the measurement from New York to Boston? And if that was figured in and added, would that make up the at least 1752 or something? Or would that
Well,
bring it closer?
that would be, I don't know. I had never asked that or never considered that. It's 1,633 miles from Kearney to New York, so you only have, 101 miles to go if you to go from New York to Boston. And my guess is New York to Boston is well over 100 miles. So that to go from New York to Boston would have increased it over the 1733.
Now that you've made that discovery, please don't tell the Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, my goal in this is just simply curiosity. It's not to destroy Kearney's identity or to tell the Chamber of Commerce that they can't use it or anything like that. Many cities have pieces of their identity that come from sources such as this. I grew up in a town in Illinois called Plano, where the manufacturing for Plano tackle boxes is, or once was. And Plano considers itself the birthplace of the reaper, because they had an early factory there from Cyrus McCormick, who was a manufacturer of farm equipment. And I've never dug back in and find out actually how correct that claim is, but I'm sure it has some sort of basis in history, but a bunch of embellishment that has happened since then. And that's true with many towns. So please don't understand that I want to destroy Kearney's identity, because that's not the purpose here.
Is that railroad route to the east still in existence?
They asked if that railroad route to the east was still in existence. How am I going to answer that? The railroads themselves are still in existence, but they're only for freight. You could still take a passenger route from here to the east on Amtrak, but Amtrak no longer goes through Kearney. You'd have to drive to Holdridge or Hastings, I think, are the two closest locations, and that would go to Chicago. And then I'm not exactly sure what the route is east of Chicago, but I know it doesn't go through Canada. So I'm not exactly sure what is in existence and what is not.
It's not exactly a question, it's just a comment on the times. During that time period, when people came in from the old country to New York, very often they had relatives south of Chicago in Illinois. So that may very well be why that was such a popular route. And then you would come to Nebraska. I know the Petersons did that in my family history. And then you bought railroad land. So that might be why that was such a promising and often used route.
That may be true. It's kind of a common misperception too that pioneers came in wagons, and yes, that was true in the days before the railroad. But most of the immigrants that came to Nebraska came via the railroad. They may have taken the railroad to the final station or to their destination, and then taken a wagon from there to their land. But people arrived by railroad, and often arrived by railroad through these types of channels from New York to Chicago and then beyond.
Thank you, John. From your review of the timetables, did you get a sense of what time of day the trains eastbound and westbound pass through Kearney? And would Kearney be an overnight stop usually, or would it be a place that they would just be here for a few minutes and then travelers would continue on their route?
I don't know, Jeff. I didn't look at the timetables that closely to see what particular times of the day they were passing through. I'm not going to speculate. I was about to say that you'd think that they would stop during the day and not during the night, because I suspect that has an impact on business. But I don't know. I do know that in that article where it speaks of the Michigan Press visitors, here, the editors and ladies will be met at the Union Depot at 9:30 a.m. So it arrived at 9:30 in the morning, and then driven around the city, taking in the various places of interest. And you may want to read the route on there too. It's kind of interesting to see what in the city was on the agenda. And then it doesn't say when they left, but it does say that they only stayed a few hours. And I don't know if they traveled then, if they headed further west, or if they headed back to Michigan. I suspect it was part of a larger tour, and Kearney was just one of the many stops.
Okay, I was just wondering if you ever found another route, like, we're speaking from the Kearney east to Boston, if you found another route that would end up making this 1,733 miles, or if that was like the only combination you found.
This was the only combination I found.
Okay.
And since by viewing the map, it is the shortest distance combination. In other words, it's going across here, not going down here.
Mm-hmm.
Another route that would take the traveler further out of their way would be more than 1,733 miles.
Okay.
So the likelihood of a second or third route existing is highly unlikely.
And you are going through Ontario there?
Yes.
Okay.
It goes from here over to Detroit, and then it goes through southern Ontario and crosses back over in Buffalo.
Okay, all right. I thought so, but...
And that could be a function too of the maps. These are the maps as they appear in the old travelers' guides, and I didn't really draw a line on here to indicate which of the railroad lines the traveler would take, but it would be this one here, and then of course this one right here that we're familiar with. So the Michigan Central would pass then on this way to Buffalo, and then you'd go from Buffalo across over here to Albany, and then the last leg would be Albany over to Boston.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Does that make it clear?
Yep.
I think it does.
Thank you.
I was interested in some of your source material there. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about finding things like this?
Oh.
And did you say that this was going to be on the Nebraska Historical website, or you talked about these? Is it the Nebraska, not the Buffalo County? It'd be the Nebraska.
It's the
And
Nebraska State
there's
Historical
some up
Society.
there already.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
To talk a bit about the sources, the timetable guides, the railway guide that you see on the screen there, I found just through a Google search and found it through Google Books. There's a gigantic scanning and digitization project that Google has been working on in conjunction with university libraries, and that's part of that of their self-proclaimed mission to make all the world's information available to people. So I was able then to download it on my computer. It's a very large PDF file. I think it's 150 megabytes or so in size. It's got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages in it. And I looked through it, on my computer. I flipped through it on my computer to find the railroads that would serve, and then the timetables too. The newspaper articles were all found digitally too, using the online archive for the Kearney Hub and the online archive for the Omaha Daily Bee. The Omaha Daily Bee's archive is a part of a Library of Congress project called Chronicling America. And if you go to the Library of Congress's website and search newspapers or Chronicling America, you'll find that very easily. Let's see what else. About a lot of this, I had a friend who's now passed away. Lived in Santa Maria, California, and he was another collector of old road maps and road guides. I visited him in Santa Maria twice in conjunction with some other research I was working on. And we were talking about this project and these ideas, and he went back room and dug out this, and I went ahead and was able to make a photocopy of it and use it too. So that is a little bit also where I get some of that primary source material. This is a widely known photograph that's held by the Historical Society. This also was part of the collection of my friend in Santa Maria, and I was able to use it, and that was one of the first things he thought of when I was talking to him about the project. And then the inside. This I purchased on eBay myself. I didn't pay but a couple dollars for it. There's avid collectors of stamp collecting and philately out there, so it was easy to find, and I saw it one day and thought, hey, that's really good. Of course, this I just saw in the newspaper, and here online also. Does that answer your question about some of the sources? And I try to acknowledge some of those here too on the end. Yes, Will.
Good talk. When the Lincoln Highway was completed and they kind of morphed the 1733 thing from the railroad to the highway, do you get the sense that the city leaders who were involved in that, the chamber, whoever was involved in morphing that identity, that they were conscious of the fact that the highway was going to be a completely different set of distances, and they did it intentionally anyways because it was good branding? What do you think?
I don't know. I don't really have any direct evidence of any decision to use it. In other words, I don't have a document or another newspaper article, for instance, that says this new highway is going to be built, and we're going to promote it using this, these measurements. My suspicion was it was probably rather just an unconscious decision, that this idea of 1733 had become so much a part of the identity that that people used it and just didn't question why or whether it still applied. Because when you think of it, it's 1890. The Lincoln Highway wasn't established till 1913, the middle of teens. That's a good 25 years. So it's a good 25 years or so for that idea to become part of the city's institutional identity.
Thanks.
I enjoyed the talk. One of the things I was wondering is if other towns in the Great Plains made similar claims about being like a midpoint on a railroad or on a highway.
No, not that I know of. The closest thing I can think of about that is Cozad and its location on the 100th meridian. And part of Cozad being on the 100th meridian too is there were some, I don't know exactly right off the top of my head, but there were some provisions within the Union Pacific Railroad and its charter about the 100th meridian. And but they are the only town that I know of that promotes that idea of location. But being between two cities, or being between Kearney is the only one that I can come up with or think about.
Uh-huh. So no, in North Dakota you have places up there that call themselves the center of the United States, or
and then there are in North Dakota there are a couple areas that are the geographical center and the geodetic center, for instance. Here you get me talking about it now, and more things is coming to my mind. Within Kansas, there are a lot of rural towns with the word center in their name. There's I can think of Hayes Center, for instance, in Nebraska here. And then, of course, my mind goes blank on the Kansas examples. Smith Center, for instance, yes. And those were often located in the center of the county, which they're named after.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Rosenoff was a physician here, and he was a big railroad aficionado. And he explained to me there was a Kearney and Black Hills Railway, and you can still see the rail bed going north, but there's also an Elkhorn and Black Hills. Did everybody want to go to the Black Hills? Was that a...
Well, the interest in the Black Hills was the gold rush that was in there. And so that was the reason for building those railroads. I don't know much about the history of that. That may have been the example that I gave here when I showed the timetable.
Yeah, you've got
I tried to show an example.
You've got an
that
Elkhorn
Fremont
Valley
and
and
Missouri
Black
Valley,
Hills
yeah.
line, yeah.
And you can kind of see here, Chicago to Missouri Valley, then Missouri Valley to Omaha, then to West Point, then to Norfolk, Neely, Oakdale, and eventually, I think I ended it down here by Valentine. Yeah, Valentine, and eventually it went to Rapid City through Chadron.
You mentioned you had some doubt that the numbers would add up at the very beginning.
Yeah.
What led into that doubt? And could you also talk about how you got interested in this topic?
Well, what led into the doubt was just simply that it just seemed far-fetched. It just seemed improbable to me that it would be equidistant on any sort of measure. Like I said at the early part of the paper, you could make us equidistant between any two locations depending on what route you choose. But you can't just choose any route. You have to choose a route either along a railroad or along a current road. Once I saw that the western end matched 1733, when that was the first end that I tried to total up. Once I saw that, I went, wow, it is true. It is. And then when then I started to look at the eastern side, and I started searching for it. I figured if I know the western side is 1733, then possibly the eastern side is too. And so I was able to search for that. And then the second part of your question?
What made you interested in the topic in the first place? Was it that visit with a friend?
Oh, it was the visit with a friend. As a geographer, I like places. I like local places, for instance. And I came here for a job, but I also came here to make my life here too. And it was just something I was curious about for Kearney, its location. And so that's kind of how I got interested in it.
And how long was your research process?
How long was the research process? I poked around at it for a while. This part right here just took an afternoon. So once I had realized that it's the railroad. The railroad is the connection here. Then I was able to zero in on that quite soon. So yeah, that part there was the afternoon to figure that out.
Going back to that western route, I had a question about the east. I know from Dr. Wells' class, we talked about how when they did build the railroad, they did so sort of quickly and not out of the greatest material. And they did kind of meander so that they would get, one, more land, and two, that they would get grants from the federal government so that it was longer distance. Was there any, redoing of the railroad that would maybe change that number, or that you would know of, or
I don't know enough about the history of the railroad to know what has been rerouted, but I do know that there are some discrepancies in numbers. If you look down here, this page right here I've got from the 1886 Rand McNally. I looked at other guides too. Here. This one is from 1890. It's the Traveler's Official Railway Guide. I use its map to show here because it had a better map that was easier for me to position on the screen. Sometimes too, with these Google documents, the scanning isn't quite right or quite clear. When you total up the numbers using that railway guide, you get different totals.
Okay.
And so there are different slight discrepancies, 1 or 2 miles on a particular timetable. And I don't know why that is, if that's because there was a little bit of realignment somewhere along the route, or if they have did they have a better way of, I would think that the measurement would be very accurate itself because it's probably based on surveying, the surveying that went into the route. Do you know, Jeff? Was it realignment?
I don't.
You don't know?
Portions of the route westward were. I can't speak to it.
We're realigned. So so if you go ahead and you find any railway guide, you may not see exactly the same numbers, but that 1886 one does.
Okay, thank you.
I was just wondering if you've published an article or published your findings anywhere?
Oh yes, I didn't mention that. I did publish the article, and it was in the summer 2015 issue of Nebraska History. I didn't place that on the screen, but I probably should have. So the summer 2015 issue of Nebraska History has a very similar version of what I just spoke with today. I believe that is the end of our time. Thank you very much for coming.